Alright. Some people are still coming in, but we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the EU Renew webinar series on Europe in the World. I am Carrie Otterberg of the Luga Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Christina L. Davis, who will discuss her new book, Discriminatory Clubs, The Geopolitics of International Organizations, which was published this summer by Princeton University Press. Christina L. Davis is the Edwin O. Reischauer Professor of Japanese Politics in the Department of Government and Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations at Harvard University. Her research interests include the politics and foreign policy of Japan, East Asia, and the study of international organizations, with a focus on trade policy. In addition to the book we'll be discussing today, she's also the author of Food Fights Over Free Trade, How International Institutions Promote Agricultural Trade Liberalization, and also Why Adjudicate, Enforcing Trade Rules in the WTO, which are both published by Princeton University Press as well. Also joining us today as expert discussant is Professor Charles Roger. Charles is an associate professor and Roman E. Cajal research fellow at the Institut Barcelona de Estudis Internacionals. His research focuses on the dynamics of formal, informal, and transnational institutions operating in the fields of climate change, international trade, global finance, and antitrust. Charles is the author of The Origins of Informality, Why the Legal Foundations of Global Governance Are Shifting and Why It Matters, published by Oxford University Press in 2020, and also a co-author of Transnational Climate Change Governance, published by Cambridge in 2014. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Christina of approximately 30 minutes, and then we will turn to Charles to kick off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions, and we'll turn back to Christina for her response. Meanwhile, we will collect questions from the audience, so feel free to send your questions for the speakers at any point during the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and I will collect your questions to share with the speakers during the Q&A following the presentations. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the EU Renew project. The EU Research and Education Network on Europe and the World, or EU Renew as we call it, is an Erasmus John Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of EU Renew, I would really like to thank Christina and Charles for joining us today. And now it is my great pleasure to pass the floor to Christina. You have the floor.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor to have a chance to join you all here. Thank you, Professor Marks, and thank you, Professor Roger, for being discussant. And I look forward to the chance of sharing my research. So let me share screen and get started. Presenting a book in 30 minutes is a challenge, but I will do my best to share a few highlights and hope that encourages you to want to read and discuss more. Really, especially since I am joining you for the EU Renew project, I'd like to share the motivation. As I was starting to think about the politics of how countries get into organizations, I was watching 8 years ago the events unfolding, as we all were, where the people of Ukraine protesting in the streets. And while the spark was a question of would they join a European Partnership Agreement, or Russia was urging them not to join the European Partnership Agreement, but instead to join a Russian customs union. And of course, the people were not really angry over the trade levels. This was about the future of Ukraine, its path forward to go closer to the West or closer to Russia. And the events that unfolded led to the downfall of the government, followed by the invasion by Russia. And we see now that Ukraine's path into Europe remains a challenge, but if anything, it has gone forward more rapidly because it is involved in direct geopolitical conflict fighting with Russia. And now Ukraine more than ever wants to join Europe to show its solidarity as part of the West. And the members of the European Union and the President of the Commission have been much stronger in the possibility that they will welcome Ukraine as a member. And it is not because their trade policies or anti-corruption policies have changed substantially. It is very much the foreign policy dynamics. This is a broader question I'm interested in that I address in my book, thinking about how when countries look at international organizations, they do care about the issues, the regulations that will be changed, but they also look more broadly at what is the cooperation with a particular set of countries. And so my book, which is long, yes, 450 pages, and it looks at membership in international organizations. And I'm going to talk about a few highlights, not all parts of the book today. So I plan to focus on my model about international organization membership as part of being a discriminatory club model, where countries choose to have discretionary rules over who joins. Then they take that discretion to inject politics with geopolitical discrimination. And I'm going to talk about how this means lowering the bar to let a friend join more easily with fewer conditions, or raising the bar to make it harder for a rival to join. And this reflects the fact that entering an international organization is very much about status and relationships, as well as cooperation on specific issues. I'll highlight a few examples from the OECD. I'll look at Japanese experience from 19th century to the current debates, and examine how even the most open organizations at the margin exclude when they decide what counts as a state. This will offer new perspectives on how multilateral organizations are very much a tool of economic statecraft. And we are seeing a shift as globalization has to accommodate new relationship shifts and rivalries with emergence of new organizations and shift in priorities. So let me get started because I only have a few minutes. I want to talk about international organizations, which many scholars have said are very important. Others have talked about how they form a credible commitment that helps states to make reforms. They are seen as a seal of approval. Investors pay attention to which organizations countries join. And even as a broad pattern, countries that are joining together have been shown to trade more and have less conflict. But of course, scholars have equally been concerned about selection bias. What if it's just that states already made their reforms before they joined? Or they're only allowed to join if they are known to be a high compliance, high performance state. Then membership may not mean very much. It could just be epiphenomenal to those underlying changes in screening mechanisms. Well, I'm actually going to argue that because foreign policy and social selection are very important, it actually reinforces the fact that states have underlying relations that are shaped when they join international organizations. And then socialization can take place that may lead to more reform than would have been the case if it was purely demand side entry or supply side screening. So I will argue that the foreign policy role of membership can actually open a role for more influence by membership in organizations. Looking at international organizations as discriminatory clubs forces us to recognize that even if cooperation seems to be about a public good, actually much of international cooperation occurs over club goods where exclusion is possible. And I'm going to focus on when exclusion is not just about those who are the most qualified to provide a public good, such as free trade, but also when you care about who is in the membership group. And similar to a social club, membership may be about more than just who is going to comply. And you have attention to what are some of the other attributes about members. And so if it was socioeconomic status for being a member in the golf club, not just how talented you are to be in the golf club. In the case of international organizations, it's actually often about foreign policy relations. Discriminatory clubs are international organizations that favor friends while excluding rivals. Now, the advantage of this process is countries would gain more when they're joining if it is a differentiation. So should Ukraine in the future join the European Union, this is more meaningful because Belarus is not joining. And it also allows states to have multiple criteria. So I will focus on geopolitical alignment, but it would be possible with all of the flexibility that countries preserve discriminatory accession, they could inject culture, democracy, some future standard. In the institutional process of membership, you're able to bring in these other criteria. And especially with security linkages, it may be better to bring it in through the back door rather than the front door of saying you must be an ally to join a trade agreement. Membership is also a way to commit that when you share this membership, you will have an ongoing stream of benefits that can be adjusted up and down among the member group. At the same time, it is part of creating a social order. And I see my book speaking to the work of Hedley Bull, where international society is about states regarding each other as being subject to the same set of rules. But who joins this community? And it actually is necessary to set boundaries, everything going back to village cooperation, the theories of Elinor Ostrom. The first step is setting boundaries of who belongs in the community. And this is done through membership. All of the international organizations have membership criteria. I look at 4 models and would say often in international organizations, we think that they are either meritocratic like the EU, where you have selection with a really precise and rigorous screening of conditions, or we have universal organizations like the World Health Organization or the United Nations, where we think they're inclusive, letting everyone in, recognizing that maybe it's vague about what they have to do to get in. Those 2 models are present, but I want to emphasize that much more cooperation happens in the club model, where an organization is selective. Not all states are welcome, but the criteria of what you do to get in is actually quite vague. Looking through 322 international organization charters, I actually find that nearly 80% fit the club model of having some selective criteria, but being quite vague about what are the eligibility rules. Even those that claim to be universal or meritocratic, on closer examination, actually have some club-like features as well. We know the European Union has been a little bit fuzzy on exactly what it takes, even while maintaining the facade of a rigorous meritocratic review of changing policies to join. So I do have a lot of statistical analysis in the book, and I'm not going to present those details today given time. But looking over the past, since 1949, multilateral economic organizations, where you wouldn't expect security to be important, and security is not listed as a criteria for entry, we still see geopolitical alignment when you measure it through proxies such as alliances or shared voting in the United Nations, appears to be a statistically significant predictor of countries being more likely to join together. I am looking at a relational measure where I look at how one potential applicant to found with another group or to join as an entrant, it matters whether their relations with the other states are close as friends or distant as non-allied, or distant as in far in the UN voting. I find this is significant in the broad set of economic organizations, and then when I subset to look just within one organization over the history of the trade regime or over the history of the OECD, by the organization, I also find there's a significant factor in the expansion. And so in the weighted decision model, it's nearly 44% of the model attributes are geopolitical relative to controlling for trade ties. If I look within the WTO trade regime, 23% increase in the likelihood of joining if you're allied when you shift to high alignment from low alignment. This is just showing that even in the security organizations, of course, you expect a positive correlation, but when you shift to economic organizations narrowly defined, you still find these security ties are a significant predictor. And it's not just a Cold War phenomenon. So when I use the mixture model to try and look at this, weighted model of trade ties and geopolitical ties, both are explaining who joins. But we see that over the Cold War, it's a significant factor, but post-Cold War, it remains a significant part of the decision-making. Looking close up at the OECD, which is the club of all clubs, we know, I'm arguing it's not just the rich democracies that join the OECD, but it is also really forming an economic counterpart to NATO. It is the West. But this occurs within an organization that has a broad mandate and yet very discretionary rules. And so if you look close up at the OECD, their rules will say the council may invite any government, but it's selective because you need unanimity by all the current members to approve. And it has not expanded to be a broad membership organization. It has expanded slowly and carefully, deciding what represents a like-minded nation. So if you look at the founding members of the OECD in 1961, of course, it's Europe plus the United States and Canada. Note Turkey, NATO ally, not who you'd expect if it were all about the highest economic governance standards. And it's also not democracy. Spain was allowed in before it had democratized. As OECD expands, it goes beyond the NATO partnership to other allies like Japan, Australia, and then gradually picking up some of the East European countries as they are shifting into the Western alignment. But also as we expand into the Latin American countries and Central America, we see those that are closest starting to join. What is also interesting is as you look at this, what are countries thinking when they try to join the OECD? They definitely see it as joining the Western club. Korea started wanting to join in the 1980s, was gently told to wait. But as Korea is shifting to be democratic and rich, it becomes a candidate and joins, even though early capital liberalization is seen as one factor that pushed it into economic crisis. Brazil, at the same time, was being encouraged to consider joining, but steps back and says, no, we're not sure we want to join. There's one great quote by one of the former finance ministers of Brazil in the early 2012, where he says that it would be political suicide for Brazil to join. And he criticizes that it lowered Mexico's foreign policy influence when it joined the OECD. But then, after Brazil shifts from being the leader of the South to wanting to be closer to the West under President Temer and then President Bolsonaro, with Bolsonaro, of course, getting close as possible to President Trump, suddenly Brazil is trying to apply to the OECD. So these are examples of what is it that is status is very much about your foreign policy affinity with the other members. At the same time, the OECD is not sure who it wants to let in. We saw that Russia in the early 1990s wants to join the OECD, actually has full accession negotiations underway, but once they invade Ukraine, this is put on hold. With a full-fledged invasion in 2022, it is canceled and Russia will not be joining the OECD. But as you look at the OECD membership, they are closer in their UN voting. They are close also to the G7. So it's very much this parallel trend of like-minded states. You could compare them to an alternative grouping of the BRICS. And if you look at the red line, you can see the new BRICS invitees from last month are even more distant in their UN voting from the core OECD membership. And so this is just one way of mapping the difference in foreign policy position from these associations of states in organizations or in informal clubs such as BRICS. Now, if I'm going to argue that IGO membership is a ticket to international society, it's good to look at a state that was outside of international society and look at the process as it evolved. For me, I've long been a scholar studying Japanese foreign policy, and Japan in the 19th century is an outsider. They were two centuries of isolation with limited ties, and then 1846 start to open, reform their government. And the step to go from an outsider restricting ties to the world to a major power recognized as such, that pathway required going through international organizations. From joining the Universal Postal Union as one step to show we are a state and we do not need foreign consular offices handling the foreign mail. And so there was this process of, as Japan joins the Universal Postal Union, Britain and France recognized that they would have used the Japanese government rather than their own foreign consular posts. We also saw that even before Japan had telegraphs connecting to Europe, they wanted to join the International Telegraph Union. Again, it was a mark of joining with the West. Joining the League of Nations, of course, was the final step to major power status. Part of that, what's really interesting, is that Japan wanted the connection to the West and wanted the major power status recognition. But this also came along with joining organizations where there was not high functional demand. The International Labor Organization is a good example. At the time, the government of Japan actually did not recognize labor unions. Joining the ILO required sending delegates from labor unions. They joined the organization, and after a while of criticism, they eventually recognized unions and let union representatives go to attend the meetings. At the same time, once you're in the organization, what happens when foreign policy relations change? The ultimate was, of course, as the League of Nations is criticizing Japan's aggression in China, Japan storms out of the League of Nations to exit. They did not want a full break of all relations, and so they actually stay in many of the other organizations, trying to keep those ties. Finally, on the path to war, they exit all organizations. So this pathway of, as you get closer, you join, and at the ultimate, you exit. At the same time, of course, after war, Japan is trying to restore ties that had been broken. Its re-entry into international relations was not just the change in Japanese government, but the sponsorship of its new ally, the United States. The United States played a key role in persuading other states that this former enemy should be allowed back. And so we see in the trade regime, the United States is the key advocate, calling other states to recognize Japan, even as they're worried that it'll flood markets. The US is offering market access to the United States while not demanding that Japan lower its trade barriers or remove all of its national industrial policies. And this is a way of trying to sponsor Japan into the organization. We see this across a range of organizations. But fast forward to the current day, what's happening? You'll see that Japan is actually not only joined a lot of organizations, but it is using organizational membership as a tool of its own statecraft in dealing with China as a rising hegemon in its own region. So Japan, of course, follows the United States to think about how do we contain China on trade. Trans-Pacific Partnership is a major trade agreement led by the United States. Trump administration comes in and exits. Japan goes forward to conclude the agreement as a way to strengthen its role as a regional leader with Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries, positioning itself against China. At the same time, even though Japan is actually one of the major donors for development in East Asia, they don't join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank because that is initiated by China. And so you see this interesting paradox of one of the largest donors in East Asia not joining the new East Asia Bank because of the rivalry with China as the leader of AIIB. When you think about how do politicians view these decisions, it's very interesting. And so I went in and looked through the Japanese parliamentary records when they were considering these two decisions. And I highlight that as the politicians are debating the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2011, they're giving a lot of attention to the agreement right at the time of rivalry with China. So the agreement starts getting negotiated in 2006. The United States is busy negotiating a major trade agreement. Japan's ignoring it. There's no attention. What happens in 2010, when you start to see the politicians talking about should we join or not join, is a major dispute between Japan and China over a fishing vessel and a disputed territory in the South China Seas. Then you see by 2014, where Japan is fully joining the agreement, there's a lot of attention. And this is, of course, also when there's a lot of tensions between Japan and China. So I think the timing and the debate reflects this issue. At the same time, when they turn to look at 2014, when China is starting to propose the AIIB, 2015 is when other countries are joining and the prospect comes of should Japan join. The parliamentarians are talking about this, but what they're talking about is should we hedge against China from the outside? And so you see the largest frequency of speeches in the Diet is about hedging against China. And there's a much lower 20% who are talking about our economic interests. So overall, I think that the politicians are also keyed into this question of the role of multilateral organizations in foreign policy, and not just what is it that's in the regulatory rules. Now, how far can we push the limits of this? I mean, multilateralism being discriminatory when it comes to aid or trade, okay. What about the universal organizations that say everyone's welcome? Well, even here, there's a little bit of discrimination. You can talk about peace and prosperity and say everyone is welcome, but ultimately, there is still selection that happens. And even these organizations have a little share of foreign policy that gets in through the back door. And this is because these organizations do have to limit whether all states can join and what counts as a state. Sovereignty is not given out easily, and so trying to recognize who is a partner for cooperation is one of the markers of allocating sovereignty. So I'm going to look at how the complex nature of what is sovereignty is actually being determined in the process of which states are members and who is excluded. If you look at organizations that say they are open to all states, you still see that not all states are members. And now that can be that maybe it says it's open to all, but not everyone wants to join. Or maybe like the OECD, all are welcome, but we get to choose who we select. And so this is just pointing to the fact that you can have open eligibility, but selective choice. And what are the conditions when you go through that process of selecting? It could be just capacity, that you're trying to make sure these are states with reasonable capacity of functioning government. It could be legal recognition, getting into sovereignty issues, that you only want to let in states that are already achieving some diplomatic recognition of their legal status. Those are important, but I argue that in addition, the political ties matter, and so this geopolitical alignment is one of the criteria that's significant. We can talk about Taiwan. It's a perfect example of a government we know is competent on capacity, but low on legal ties, and strained on geopolitical ties with rivalry of support from some and intense opposition of contested sovereignty as China upholds a one China policy. And this has led to the fact that a highly competent government does not have its sovereignty recognized, and it is excluded from organizations. Now, it once was a member, so the discrimination actually began against the PRC. If we think that for decades, the government in Taiwan represented all of China, while mainland China lacked representation. And then in 1971, this switches. But it's not inevitable that there has to be an either or. Contested sovereignty has many solutions. And we do see this, where the Asian Development Bank includes both Taiwan and China. The WTO and APEC have had parallel entry where the two join together with equal status. And of course, we've seen the South Korea, North Korea case where they were kept out of the United Nations during the Cold War. The end of the Cold War brought both as equal members of the United Nations, even while both continue to aspire to unification of single Korea in the future. The question of why Taiwan remains on the outside is, of course, the intense opposition by China and the fact that it's been able to get other countries to agree to that foreign policy decision. It shows the limits of universalism, where major powers can be gatekeepers when they contest sovereignty. At the same time, the United States may contest Palestine as a state and Israel object, but through the membership vote to allow Palestine into UNESCO, it has in effect gained sovereignty as a member of UNESCO, one of the UN-affiliated organizations. And so this also points to the fact that major power gatekeeping has its limits, depending on how far it goes to get a coalition in opposition, and also on the rules of whether it has veto power, or in the case of UNESCO, you just need the majority approval. So we see this mixed politics of how far we go to limit sovereignty and exclusion. International organizations are discriminatory clubs. They can keep to a small group of like-minded states. They can expand, keeping out a rival as they expand gradually, and raising the bar so that rivals pay more in conditions when they join. And if it becomes too large of a club, form a new organization with a new set of friends. So overall, I see a strong effect of geopolitics on who joins, how much they have to do, and this is one path of defining international society. We saw with Japan how it broadened its international coalition. We've seen the recognition of states occurring through membership in organizations. It is a politicization. These organizations are not as multilateral and universal as we think. At the same time, it does have the virtue of including a group of cooperators who can make multiple kinds of trade-offs of what is the benefit of the organization. And if there's a loss of efficiency because they don't have as high a cooperation on trade rules or environmental standards, they may be gaining through the socialization process of allies. And eventually, in the long term, the trade barriers will come down, the protection for the environment will increase. So it is a complicating factor when you're trying to evaluate the efficiency of what do you get from the organization if you recognize that you're not joining the organization just because you care about the rules in the charter, but also because you care about which other members you're going to associate with through sharing this common cooperation. Thanks so much. I went fairly fast to try and present the book in 30 minutes. I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Christina. I think you did manage to pack in a lot of information into this short presentation, so thank you for that. But I think I speak for many members of the audience that will be picking up the book very soon. Now we'll turn over to Charles for reflections and questions.
Right. So thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this book, which I have actually already purchased, and I do encourage everybody else to go out and buy as well. And also I wanted to congratulate Professor Davis on this remarkable accomplishment. It's actually an enormous contribution, this book, and also pioneering in a way. I actually had to, as I started diving into it, I was thinking about how many studies have actually been published on this seemingly basic question about international organizations. Why do states join them, in terms of thinking about that from the perspective of membership? And there were remarkably few. I mean, I could definitely count a couple. And even if I expanded it to journal articles and other things, this question sort of wasn't as adequately addressed as you might think, given all of the array of different things that people have focused on. So we've looked at impacts and dynamics and everything, but not this fundamental question. So in terms of the contributions of the book, I won't rehearse the argument again. I'll confine myself just to a couple of points. First thing, I think that this book does a great job of encouraging us to think about IOs as clubs. Now, this is not the first piece to say that. In fact, we sort of like, if I think about scholarship on IOs, the term club gets bandied about very, very loosely all the time, with this suggestion that there's something deeper behind it. But often there isn't something deeper behind it. It's just sort of another term. But this book shows that there's something actually substantial behind that. And it's one of a few. The other one that comes to mind is Laura Ann Viola's recent book, which is also excellent, which encourages us to think about IOs as clubs and specifies in quite concrete terms what that means and how that changes our view on many of the processes of IOs. The second thing is geopolitics. So it obviously offers this account of membership that builds on the idea that geopolitics matter and places that at its core. And so rather than being sort of random agglomerations or purely functionalist considerations, it shows that political alignments shape both the demand and the supply side of the membership equation. And it provides us with a wealth of evidence, fascinating new data on the membership provisions of charters, which is a reason alone to go out and buy the book, just to see what it says there. But also all of these rich streams of evidence from both the quantitative and qualitative analysis, including an array of great case studies, which I just thoroughly enjoyed reading all of these fascinating stories about the two Koreas, Japan, Turkey, Taiwan, Palestine, and so forth. And so I think that this matters for a couple of reasons. So first of all, from a policy perspective, as Professor Davis sort of finished off by saying, it shows that there's other things that are going on in states' sort of calculations behind that reshape what it is that IOs do. And if they're not sort of providing all of the functional benefits that we would otherwise expect, that actually means that not that the IO is failing in some way, but there's all sorts of other considerations going on in the background that matter. I think from the theoretical perspective, there's many sort of different things. I think, though, that one of the takeaways for me was this sort of new insights that it offers into this, classic depth participation dilemma and how states engage with that in view of all of their geopolitical alignments. And then empirically, for scholars that are doing work in completely different areas from thinking about membership decisions as such, it matters as well because there's this selection process that's going on. And even if we want to understand their impacts or other things that are going on in the IO, we really have to think through how that matters for research. And I think that this book does a great job of highlighting that. So now, in terms of my questions, there's so many possibilities I'll have to confine myself greatly. But the first one is probably inevitable, which is about informal IOs. Of course, if I think back to the recent news headlines, the biggest sort of expansion of an IO in sort of the past couple months that's gotten coverage in everything from foreign affairs to the FT is the expansion of the BRICS, which is an informal IO and is quite a bit different from some of the institutions that you look at. It's a remarkable development. And it's one that I think your book should have something to say. But in fact, at the very start of the book, it sort of says, I'm not going to be speaking to these, and I'm going to focus on formal IOs. Well, fair enough. These are different. There's other considerations. It's totally fine to have those scope conditions. But I wonder to what degree you think this book has something to say to these. Do these institutions operate actually in a sufficiently different way? Or does the argument that you're saying about geopolitical alignments capture what's going on there quite effectively? Obviously, you haven't done this in detail, but this is probing sort of the edges of your arguments. The other thing is, which is also probing the edges a little bit, is about varieties of membership. So your book focuses mainly on full membership. So when a state really gets all of the rights that a membership in an international organization offers. But as someone who's also collected a fair amount of membership data on international organizations, there's quite a few other categories out there: observers, associate members, informal permanent members like Spain in the G20, for instance. And even more recently, Stephanie Hoffman and her co-authors have asked us to expand our thinking about membership to think about memberness, because there's all sorts of other relationships between different kinds of states that I think are interesting to think about. And so again, although this is not the focus of your book, you must have developed some thoughts about these different categories of membership. And so I wonder if we look at those categories and the dynamics going on around them through the lens of the argument you present, how should we think about these different relationships? Now, the final question that I'm going to ask is about the role of structure. In terms of alignments, there are other, people who have said that geopolitical alignments matter for various kinds of international relations, and I think your work builds actually really nicely on them. And the the key work for me that I think you're building on a little bit is Joanne Goa's work. And she's mostly focused on trade, as you have in your past work as well. But she actually offers a little bit more of a structural perspective, suggesting that polarity and multipolarity really matter for these geopolitical alignments, and then also the depth of cooperation that results. And so it maps on very closely to some of the things that you're getting at. But I think that you actually sort of resist this temptation to suggest that structure matters so much. And that comes out most clearly in the chapter with Tyler Pratt, where I think that you're saying, geopolitics matters whether the system is bipolar or not, right? But I wonder if we can actually say something more than that, which is that the system structure may matter and geopolitics may matter, but it might matter differently, right, in different kinds of systems. And so I wonder to what degree, rather than saying it, geopolitics matters all the time, what degree structure sort of matters for these geopolitical alignments, and then also the structure of membership patterns of IOs. Okay, I will leave it there. Congratulations again on the fantastic book, and I look forward to your response and all of the other questions.
Christina, we'll turn back to you right away. And I just want to remind the audience that they can send their questions through the Q&A function, and we'll get to the audience Q&A in just a few moments. So over to you, Christina.
Okay. Thank you so much. Great discussion. I appreciate your encouraging words, and it means a lot to me to have you say that you see this as new and important. And I must say that I marked the scope condition of not discussing informal IOs because I thought you had done such a good job. And seriously, though, to engage with that scope condition, I think it was a theoretical and an empirical motivation that I limited my study. In theory, I do believe that I'm talking about boundaries, and formal status is what really sets the limit of allocation of benefits and sovereignty. And that at that point, membership in an organization that has flags in front of a secretariat and some concrete benefits that have legal commitment is a more likely fit with what I'm talking about. And that doesn't mean that I don't think it also occurs in a lesser degree in the informal organizations. And so that's where, to be honest, the empirical side comes in that I'm coding charters, rules on accession. And so those where there is not a charter rule are more difficult to code. And there's not a sharp boundary of who is in and out, or it would be harder to track. And so there, I think I was just trying to limit my work by letting other scholars focus on the informal. But I do believe that there is a similar dynamic happening. So, clearly, even like I put up the slide showing the OECD versus the BRICS, and it was fascinating to watch the BRICS members as India was saying we want more rules over what it takes to be a member, and China pushing back, not wanting to formalize that. And so even at this organization, there was a debate about wanting more discretion over what it takes, and why is it that Iran would be in and someone else would not be chosen? You don't really want to formalize that. You just want it to happen. And so I do think that, one could say the informal organizations are just one more step of the full discretion to let it emerge. And it's just not as high stakes again because it won't play for sovereignty. But the varieties of membership is important. I bring that out a little more in the OECD, where it's really interesting. I was fascinated to see how many countries participate in the OECD committees and sign its conventions, but do not become members. And again, because of this emphasis on who is in the club as a formal state matters for sovereignty, and the benefits that are a signal of your association, I do think the formal status of being a member matters, and the governments clearly think it matters. And so Brazil was perfectly comfortable to have one of the highest levels of participation in committees and signing commitments like the anti-corruption agreement, even as their government at that time was saying, we absolutely don't want to be a member. Like the OECD was pretty much inviting them after 2007, and they were saying, no, thank you. And so that difference between informal, and it's not even informal, they're listed as participants in the committees, they sign a legal treaty, but actual membership is where you take your foreign policy and say, we are with them. And so I do think that matters. But clearly a next agenda would be to say, prove that and go out and compare the two. So thank you for the challenge. Joanne and I were long colleagues. I love her work. I think she's right that there is a security benefit that makes states view economic cooperation differently. But the logic of the security externality as income that could go to a rival suggests that you would have a quick end when they are no longer an ally. And so the puzzle that I see is these multilateral organizations don't have a lot of expulsion. And so I do think there's a more geopolitical statecraft logic that is much softer of, we think you're leaning our way, letting Poland join the GATT in the 60s, not because it had become an ally. And so it's much more statecraft than the strict hardcore, that money could go to buy weapons that is in the security externality logic of Joanne. And that's also why, I don't expect the sharp change at polarity, because it's much more of a loose statecraft approach. And even when you're not in a bipolar world, if anything, you have more interest in the uncertainty of a multipolar realm to bring in states. So maybe that's to your point, that it could be that it matters differently. And so you might see a shift from rewarding allies in bipolarity to a little more of the positive incentives in a multipolarity. And I probably should look at that a little more too. I'll add another 100 pages. Should I go to the questions myself and read an answer?
No, I will. I'll read them out to you. We have a few that are sort of similar, so I'll try to group a little bit. So we'll start off with a group of three, if that's okay with you. So first we have a question on hiring processes within international organizations, and if you observe this sort of club discrimination effects on the staff recruitment process. For instance, do they tend to prefer candidates from specific countries or developed or donor countries? Or is it a requirement to hold a passport from a developed country to be considered a head for these organizations? So how do these dynamics play out in recruitment processes for staff? We also have a question on what is the role of the Secretariat of an IO to facilitate or not membership of new members in case of the OECD? Do you have any evidence of the OECD Secretariat opposing some members? And then the third question is, do you see differences in how these dynamics unfold depending on different institutional characteristics of a given organization? For instance, if they have majority voting procedures versus consensus, and so on. I think we'll start with those three.
Right. Thanks. Excellent questions. On the staffing, it is an interesting point. The international organizations will have staffing based on merit, but also staffing based on allocation of key member states. And so one could also imagine that that politics would be important. And I do think that we see, if looking at influence within an organization, a larger share of staff has been shown to encourage influence. And we also see that as a push for why states might want to form their own organization. When China was unhappy about not having enough staff in the IMF or the World Bank, whereas when it forms the AIIB, it can have a larger influence. And we certainly do see the top of the organization sort of being an allocation of which state appoints it. I have not looked carefully at the staffing question in terms of how quickly a new member gets a share of the staff, and that's an interesting point. And so I think it would certainly be important if I'm looking at this as the association value of the state, if it's happening through the diplomatic channel, to look at how quickly are they sending their diplomats and getting representation within the organization. So I take that as a really interesting question to pursue. The OECD Secretariat, so it sort of follows nicely. Do the staff at the highest level have influence? And yes, they do. And so they will say it's a member-driven organization, and that's especially true for some. And at the limit, the staff are following what the members say. But there are points where the Secretariat can have influence. And so when I mentioned that Korea had first tried to join the OECD in 1982, it was the OECD Secretary General who gently told the Korean diplomat that no, this was not the time. And there's definitely back and forth of hand-holding by Secretariat officials when countries are starting to inquire about becoming an applicant. And so I think that especially in the accession process, the Secretariat has more leeway to push forward the advocacy and help one be seen as better on the merits. At the end, though, the foreign policy issue can't be changed. And so I think that the Secretariat influence is more likely on the functional side, while it's the diplomatic head of state level that would influence the foreign policy alignment that's in my theory. Last question, voting rules do matter in terms of how big of a coalition do you need? And so I look at the stringent rules. Some organizations require unanimity or a 2/3 vote, and I call that stringent, that it's not just selective, but it's selective in having a high bar. And that actually can increase the role of foreign policy. But I don't find that it's the decisive factor. And so it was interesting that you can have organizations that have majority rule and still appear to see geopolitics making a difference, while in the stringent, it can also be a factor. So I think that is part of the design when they're choosing how closely do they want to hold that gatekeeping ability. And so it is an important design choice to maintain unanimity. And so we can see that, Cyprus being a member of the EU will always be a problem for Turkey trying to join. And so we do have that type of a gatekeeping threshold when there's high voting rules.
Great, thanks a lot. We have a couple more questions. It seems we have a lot of questions on different types of organizations beyond some of the typical formal international organizations that you've covered. One person's asking about the security tech clubs like Quad and AUKUS as a new model of club. And we also have another question going back to the idea of these informal organizations. I know we already discussed this a bit, but do you see this as making the landscape more complex? And do you see this as changing sort of like the club rules or the club dynamics for the formal organizations, the proliferation of alternatives, for instance? So maybe we can talk about those. I think that's all the time we'll have. But let's go from there.
Right. Yes, I think that, we could consider that the informal are a prototype of let's start at the informal and it will harden over time, in which case, it's interesting when you look at ASEAN, it actually is included in our formal international organization data set. Even when in its beginnings in the 60s, it was very informal without a real proper secretariat. And it is over time that ASEAN has developed. And Anya Yetke and others have done a lot of really interesting work on these regional organizations and how they evolve. And so I think that's, one part of the process is when you have enough uncertainty about how tight of an association you want, you don't yet have a formal organization. And the informals offer a way to have close cooperation and leader statements, but you're not giving out very much. And, we're seeing the need for that. I think it reflects that the formal organizations don't expel quickly. And states are, as their foreign policy shifts, their priorities shifts, they're finding some of these formal organizations expanded too much. Again, through statecraft, you let in a state thinking they're going the right direction, you might have made a mistake, and then you find you have a problem. Or you let in cumulatively too many, and you've got an organization that's very large. And then flexibility comes from a informal area where you can talk and then decide whether that's going to be formalized or not. So that would be my sense for how to deal with these different types of IOs and the AUKUS. I don't engage with it enough in the book, so that's an interesting area for more research, to take the informal and the formal and compare.
Awesome. Thank you very much for these really interesting answers and for a really great presentation. I think that's all the time we have today for questions. So we'll have to end there, but I would like to once again thank you, Christina, and you, Charles, for joining us today, as well as everyone in the audience for taking part and sending in your questions. Before leaving you, I would like to quickly announce that the fall lineup for the EU Renew webinar series is available at eurenew.eu or eu-renew.eu. For our next webinar on the 18th October, we'll be joined by Ranjit Lal on the politics of performance in international institutions. In November, Peter Trubowitz and Brian Burgoon will discuss their book on fractures in the Western liberal tradition. And in December, Jean-Philippe Terrien and Vincent Pouliot will join us to discuss the patchwork of actors and processes in today's global governance. And you can sign up for all of those at eu-renew.eu. Thanks again for everyone for joining us today, and especially for our speakers, Professor Christina Davis and Professor Charles Roger.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the discussion and appreciate the opportunity.
Congratulations again, Christina.
Thanks, Charles.
All right, take care.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.